Hi, so I'm going to talk to you this morning about China and its tradition of rebellion. Really, what we're looking at is a very exciting time in China. We're talking about from the 1860s onwards, and of course the Taiping Rebellion. But remember that China has a long-standing tradition of rebellions that C.K. Yang talks about, and talks about this as a tradition of rebellion. The picture there is of the Nian Rebellion, which actually lasts longer than the Taiping Rebellion, actually. So what we're really interested in is what caused this decade of real turmoil in China from the 1860s through into the 1870s, and what's going on in China. And always we see, again, as C.K. Yang talks about, the problems of famine and food shortages. This happens really because at the latter part of the Qing era, the Chinese population triples between about 1680 and 1820. So throughout the Qing period, the population has been growing, and in that really short time period, less than 200 years, the Chinese population has tripled. And really, by the 1820s, 1830s, that hadn't really had too much impact on people's standards of living. Basically, food production techniques had managed to kind of stay in line with people's needs, and there was increasing commodity trading going on before 1842 and before the arrival of the treaty ports and all of the problems that we associate with the Opium Wars. So the Qing really, at this time period, things are going quite well for them. The population is growing. That's a sign of prosperity, a sign of satisfaction. And really, taxes at this time are fairly light. Okay, the Qing aren't really having to pay for much. And the things that the government taxes are needed to pay for, roads and infrastructure, flood control, are generally being provided to an adequate level. So what's beginning to happen, though, by the 1820s and 1830s is the population growth, but perhaps seemed to be a blessing, later on begins to kind of become a curse. And really, that's the start of the problem with this kind of increasing population pressure on China at this time. So you can see from the graph there the huge increase in population under the Qing period, and it's that kind of steep and huge growth that really kind of takes them by surprise from sort of the 1750s onwards, really. And what happens is this: the Qing make a very sensible decision. They encourage population migration. They have lots of Han people moving out to areas traditionally that Han haven't lived in, particularly in northeast China around Manchuria. And though that population dispersion, people are provided with incentives to migrate, actually again begins to relieve the problem. But obviously there's only so many places that people can go to. So a lot of the problems that affect the Chinese and China at this time are really beginning to be caused by the population increase. By the mid-19th century, China's population reaches 450 million, and by the 1840s and 50s, this is now causing land shortages, food shortages, and increasing rural poverty. In order to try and relieve the situation, the Qing increase taxes. They start asking people for more money so they can try and bolster up things. They can try and help farmers invest and so on. And of course, obviously that begins to backfire. But the other problem is that really the land that hadn't been farmed before is now under tremendous pressure. Throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, as the population has been slowly increasing, the creative responses, intensive irrigation, better different strains of rice, new types of food coming in from the New World, things like sweet potatoes and corn, have also, that kind of space has been exhausted, it's been filled up. And of course, it leads to erosion, and that leads to as trees are being chopped down for fuel, and so on. And that erosion, of course, is going to cause its own problems, particularly when it comes to flooding. So by this time, then, famine is becoming a kind of recurrent problem for China at this time. And again, we're talking about the mid-19th century. Government also doesn't keep up. In other words, the Qing don't expand their bureaucracy, they don't expand their administration. So the machinery of government, that low taxation, that low light government of the Qing that had worked perhaps in the 17th century no longer works in the 19th century. You really don't have an increase in the number of people that are there to organise and manage affairs, particularly rural affairs, those district magistrates that would have dealt with roads, that would have dealt with infrastructure. Those guys are under tremendous pressure, and one administrator by this stage could be responsible for up to 250,000 people. So government officials are overwhelmed, they're powerless, and it also causes problems, rural resentment, and so on. So it's a real challenge, and the famine and the problems that are caused by the increasing population really takes it out of people. And also this coincides in the 1850s with a series of floods of the Yellow River, and that's largely been caused by deforestation, but the problem is exacerbated because the dikes that were supposed to hold back the Yellow River haven't been maintained. So one of the things that Yang often points out, and you can see this in the quote on the PowerPoint, is that he says very clearly that there's been no rebellion without an agricultural crisis, and he makes that strong link in Chinese history all the way through. If we go back and have a look at other rebellions that happened earlier on in the 1800s, such as White Lotus, they're also occurring in areas where famine was close by. And so people are ready to be stirred up. They've got nothing to lose. And Yang again makes this point here, and this is a quote from a region being described in the 1800s. So people are ready for, any kind of solution to their problem. So the Qing struggle, as we know, and they are under tremendous pressure. As we know, the imperial examination system ensures a quality of local magistrate. However, once you've done all those exams, whether you've passed them after 8 years or 20 years, you're hoping for perhaps a little life of luxury and so on. So it can be suggested really that the Qing are incompetent, but remember, these magistrates probably are fairly competent. They're well examined. What in the Chinese classics might not necessarily prepare them for the demands of rural administration. But now, after the Opium Wars, after the Treaty of Nanjing, the Qing are being forced to raise taxes, the local officials are under tremendous pressure, and they still want to live their nice life. They still want to, enjoy the benefits of the labours that they went through to pass those imperial exams. So one of the things that begins to emerge as an alternative to the Qing government are secret and religious societies. And you can go onto TigerTube and have a look at the Rebel Nation video as well, which takes you through some of these ideas. And these guilds, these secret groups, were often related to trade or particular employments that people shared, whether they were ditch diggers, water carriers, and so on. But mostly it's a middle class thing. The guilds and these kind of secret societies in turn, perform like little mutual aid things. They would help people out in times of trouble. And as time goes on, these guilds, these organisations become more and more powerful. But as I said, they kind of emerged, through trade, through business. They are natural networks that people set up for mutual benefit. As time goes on, some of them develop kind of secret elements to them, handshakes, signals, words and phrases. And of course, some of them are involved in, criminal activity. So these groups become more and more influential and more powerful, and remain so throughout this kind of end of the Qing period. So of course it's the Taiping Rebellion that most questions focus on, and of course it's the most devastating conflict in recent history. And the Taiping region starts in that mountainous south of China, where arable land has always been limited. Life is tough and families suffer because of frequent droughts. So in this kind of condition of poverty and rural hardship, is the Taiping Rebellion that emerges. And as you know, Hong Shui-kwan begins to have these visions, these ideas. He has this breakdown. He sees this vision of himself where he's cast as the younger brother of Jesus. This kind of warped idea of Christianity that he's kind of collected from missionary pamphlets is the sort of spark point and the starting point for the Taiping Rebellion. And as we know, they sort of crossed through huge swathes of southern China. So there's a number of documents that are available that go through the Taiping beliefs, and there's a document-based question from Columbia also that takes you through the kind of thinking of the Taiping, and they have a pretty socialist base to their ideology. They also preach abstinence, but they also have this religious element as well. So it's totally new ideas and kind of sort of mishmashed into a kind of sort of Chinese Christian socialist rebellion. But of course, as we know, things go on and fall apart in terms of where the Taiping Rebellion goes. They end up in Nanjing, and of course from there on they settle down, start taking on the trappings of wealth, and that really sparks on the collapse of the Taiping Rebellion with internal divisions and infighting. Thank you for listening.